In the midst of the recent CNN coverage of the revolution in Egypt, many of you may have missed a small but fascinating story concerning Miguel de Cervantes, author of the famous novel Don Quixote. Apparently, in a dusty basement in an obscure province on the plains of La Maya in Spain, an early draft of Don Quixote's legendary confrontation with the windmills was discovered this week. And surprisingly, this early version of the story confirms what many have long suspected, that the adventure was never a parody of medieval chivalry, as is conventionally reported, but instead was a treatise on new architecture. The rough outline of the events of that day on the plains of La Maya has significance for us here because the Cervantes draft sets down for the first time in the modern era the parameters of the battle for the future of architecture. Contrary to the suppositions of literary critics, the events described by Cervantes were not fantasy, but a historic polemic obligating the art of building to a revolutionary future. CNN reports tonight that archaeologists are now excavating the Mayan plains for remnants of the structures proposed by Quixote following his demolition of the windmills. As you know, two personalities drive the Cervantes narrative, but because the recently discovered manuscript is old and tattered, it's difficult to make out the original names, which are subtly different from those that have come down to us in the traditional version of the story. The first appears to be a Sancho Alonso, a realpolitik, plain-spoken, everyman sort, and the second, a Don Hernan Quixote de la Maya, a champion of the unorthodox. These two heroes from today forward will belong to the annals of architecture legend. The latest attempt to reconstruct this prodigious piece of architecture history is as follows. For many weeks, Don Hernan Quixote remained sequestered, arguing the cause of new architecture with the luminaries of the local establishment who, as is ever the case, hoped to dissuade the Don from his avant-garde propensities. During this time, De la Maya persuaded the skeptical Alonso to join the crusade for new architecture. As Cervantes tells it, a pragmatist and a dreamer were finally joined. Traversing La Maya, searching for a stage for their historic confrontation, the two suddenly caught sight of the flailing arms of 30 gargantuan megamills, of the sort that had been constructed over and over again for 1,000 years on the Mayan plains. Don Hernan turned to Sancho Alonso. "We're in luck," he is quoted as saying. "Here, fortuitously, we encounter the opportunity to right 1,000-year wrong. Here are 30 bloated bulwarks of architecture tradition, propelling the winds of thoughtless redundancy forever. I intend to fight and kill these bastions of repetition and free the plains of La Maya for a new and as yet unimagined architecture. And we must demolish the ruins, or they will reappear." "Perhaps there are too many," said the tactically minded Sancho, "and we are too few. Wind blows from the past and overwhelms the present. Let's retreat and leave the field for another day, when allies will join us. The enormous arms are powerful and their reach is long. Tradition has an infinite reach." Creation is an outpatient search, said Don Hernan. The fight is always lonely. If we wait till our ranks increase, the battle will take place elsewhere. Giants with enormous arms fan huge winds, but to procrastinate is to concede. And the present should never concede the future to the past. If we defer, someone, somewhere will not. Gigantism always engenders an enemy. Today on the plains of Lamaya, we are the enemy. And new architecture requires an enemy. When they fall, we'll all see, said Alonso, that the giants weren't giants at all, just sleeping old machines. Back and forth swung the battle that day on the plains of Lamaya. Night came, and then again the sun rose. Hernan and Alonso charged. 30 giants whirled to respond. Rumbling, tumbling, bumbling, stumbling. Past up, future down. Future up, past down. And here, suddenly, Cervantes' original breaks off in the midst of the contest on the Mayan plain. The final pages of the story are missing. Fortuitously, a relative of the combatants of that historic day survives and is with us this evening. Perhaps tonight we'll learn how the battle for the future of architecture on the plains of Lamaya concludes. Please welcome Don Hernan, Quixote, Sancho Diaz, and Alonso to SCI-Arc.
Okay, officially, in fact, how you follow that? Well, thank you for extraordinary introduction and for the friendship and support over the years. This one is kind of a tricky one. I mean, to lecture in SCI-Arc is like going back to your parents' house and say, Dad, Mom, this is what I've done with my life the last 10 years. More likely than not, your mother will think everything's amazing, and your father will think, well, you can do better. So thinking about it, the question was if I can get away with just come and lecture in the way that I would lecture anywhere else. And I thought that I can't for a couple of reasons. One, because I realized that the attention spans of our audience in SCI-Arc is 1 hour. So if I use only one monitor, it will take us an hour and a half to go through the images and the animation. That's the reason of two, not so much ego. The second one was that this year makes 10 years since I came to SCI-Arc, which, looking back into the work, it has been so entertaining, the way that the stuff that we produce in the office and what we're doing here with the students and the people and the working students along the years. I just realized, with the exception of one out of the 40-something people in those 10 years, they were all from SCI-Arc. So I thought that I will do something that usually I don't do, is to show 10 years of work. I mean, since the first project is the first project I did around the same time and came to SCI-Arc, so I'm going to try to go as fast as I can from some of the other ones and get closer to, and talk a little bit more about the recent one, which are probably the one that interests me more in terms of my own ambitions and ideas. Now, that being said, the clip I'm going to show you, I thought a lot about if I should show it or not, due to the recent appointment that I have. So I feel like I have a sense of responsibility that I never felt before. But I thought, what the hell? We should do it anyway. So if we can have some audio.
With famed 1976, or a session with famed producer Bruce Dickinson. And luckily for us, the cameras were rolling.
All right, guys, I think we're ready to lay this first track down. By the way, my name is Bruce Dickinson. Yes, the Bruce Dickinson. And I gotta tell you, fellas, you have got what appears to be a dynamite sound.
Coming from you, Bruce, that means a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you're Bruce Dickinson.
This is incredible.
I can't believe Bruce Dickinson digs our sound.
Easy, guys. I put my pants on, just like the rest of you, one leg at a time. Except, once my pants are on, I make gold records. All right, here we go. Don't fear the Reaper. Take one, roll it.
All right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Bruce, could you come in here for a second, please?
That was gonna be a great track. Guys, what's the deal?
Are you sure that was sounding okay?
I'll be honest, fellas, it was sounding great, but I could have used a little more cowbell. So, let's take it again. And Gene,
Yeah.
really explore the studio space this time.
You got it, Bruce.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
explore the space. I like what I'm hearing. Roll it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Those words are very general. The question is, for me, over these years, is how you try to own them and how you try to make it your own, and how ultimately you start to develop your own voice in relation to these problems. So, for me, the condition of the studying and the production of form always has been at the center of what interests me, but also have to do with kind of a very specific notion of accumulation of disciplinary knowledge, and in that case, the example of Francis Bacon for me always has been incredibly useful, not in the way that it has been more lately, but in the pure notion of act of painting. So it's oil on canvas, it can be traced back to Velázquez, it's within the tradition of the field, but also at the same time it starts to introduce condition that belongs to a very particular moment of culture with a very particular sense of sensibilities and a particular sense of the context. The other one has to do with the notion of the grotesque, which is, for me, was kind of an interesting discovery, but in the work of somebody like Goya, is something that always been, I've been obsessed with it, and we'll go back to that. And then the last, I would say, introductory point that I want to make briefly is the control of the geometry and the mechanism of the geometry, and to understand what a drawing is and how you operate within that to produce normative qualities or normative conditions is something that it doesn't seem to be operating within that. This is how to lay out a croissant from Enrique Mirages, which, as many of you know, is one of my heroes. And the other one has to do much more with the raw and the unravel a certain kind of the unknown or what it seems to be more evident, and introducing it in different territory, like in the work of Daniel Hirsch. But the thing is that, if we can have a little bit out of here, sensibilities on time and cultural interactions of contamination are incredibly determinating. These are basically two images of what is, at the fundamental level, the same movie. The one on your right is La Jetée, which is basically a series of slides that operate perfectly in sync with the 60s. The one is from 12 Monkeys from Terry Gilliam, which start to operate at the end of the 90s in a totally different cultural context. My point is that ideas are incredibly important and they have a very an extraordinary weight and value in what we do, but also to me it's a lot about how you unravel the logic and how you start to operate and how you start to find your own rhythm and how you start to find your own cacophony, how you start to find your own logic, how to work around those ideas. So I'm not saying that ideas are not important for me. I'm just saying that idea is one part of the problem and the other one is how you start to work on it. And I would say that in the work in the last 10 years, certainly in the first part, there has been much more emphasis in the how than in the what. That I would say the more recent work is starting to shift slightly. Now, the first episode is what I call experiments. In the sense of, I think we throw those words, experiments and research and stuff like that very, very often and very light. I think experiment is completely different than research. Experiment is when you try different logic. You try different, you experiment with one thing at a time and you try to understand certain conclusion and not always the target is so clear. So there was a desire, certain clear patterns about geometry and form, and singular surface softwares and all that, but it was much more about to try to understand what was the potential of that thing, and the idea how the notion of continuity can start to operate. But I would say each of them are like experiments that they don't have a necessary or necessarily a coherence if they start to operate within that. Out of that, the only one that we managed to build to a certain scale was an installation here in SCI-Arc in 2002 called Emotional Rescue, which is not that interesting, but it has certain. I forgot to mention, this is a competition that we did for Lexington in 2001 for a park. The only reason I mention because this is the only competition that we ever won. So I'm going to show you a lot of competitions, so I don't need to repeat this is a competition that we lost. We lost all of them. This is the only one that we won, so I just pointed out. So I don't need to repeat myself. But the thing is, we start to work with certain logic and a certain autonomy and really focuses more in almost like a very small problems and start to understand how they go together and how this condition of the image for the production of form can start to become more specific and how we start to work on it. And the thing is that we were working out of projects that were on a small scale, so we learned certain tricks that they were useful to start to think, okay, what if we amplify the scale? So we start to operate with the idea, can we combine multiple units and then start to accumulate into something else? Now, as I said, these were more kind of experiments trying to understand if we can find a rhythm or a certain logic in terms of the work operate. And the project on your left, there was a competition for U2 Tower in Dublin. It became an important one because it was the first time that the reaction was certain people were looking at the work having like a grotesque quality or a grotesque condition. What is interesting is that grotesque is a definition that we usually associate with the problem of ugliness or disgusting, and it's not necessarily the origin of that. The origin of grotesque, it was around the time of Goya painting. It had to do more with when something cannot be cataloged under the canons of any particular cultural time. So that notion of grotesque was an interesting one because one thing that you learn is that you cannot really produce and choreograph grotesque. It's more like a byproduct quality of the work. But what you can start to control is to produce a sense of what I call it the horrific, which you have to do with also a sense of a sensational quality as a way to start to produce a different condition of beauty, or what I like to call beautiful. I know that beauty and beautiful seems to be the same, but at least the way I'm trying to understand and maybe come from my English limitation, as you notice by now, is that beautiful has to do with much more like a kind of a temporary, more in-the-moment condition, which I think beauty responds to a much larger classical canon. So in that sense, one way that you can start to think is some of the problems are always classical and some of the problems are always contemporary. And at the same time, for me, one of the beauty and the power of architecture is that they move incredibly slow and in a way always operate in a state of incompleteness. And I think that always is the best way for architecture to be, is to always be in a state of incomplete. So the second episode is called A Lot of the Same, which is basically when the work starts to respond to a kind of a more direct and specific series of ambition but with let's say with the desire that out of one singular entity, or what we call it cells, in a bad use of the word cell, and if we can produce an infinite amount of variation about the singular entity, then it can be reconfigured. So when we did the PS1 competition, sorry, I lied, we won this one. When we did the PS1 competition, we won and we built PS1 MOMA in New York. Part of the thing was to try to create a project that it cannot read in the totality, even though in the images in the picture it can do, but when you will be there, you can read it more as a cinematic or more like as a sequential condition. So more as a series of sensation and different levels of uncomfort or different. It was not the idea to produce a comfortable environment, but it was much more the idea to produce different sequences, almost like a torture logic. So the animation that you see on the right, by the way, the animations that we're playing are usually the main projects of the family. The one that the animations are like, they were like the nest of where we develop multiple projects around that. In the office, we always like to work in multiple projects at the same time. So, and try to nurture that out of one kind of what I call a genetic code. We can produce 4 or 5 projects, and if we can work in multiple scales, the better. And there is a desire, not that the work is scaleless, but there's a certain ambition that some of these things can move from one territory to another, not in a seamless way, but suffering very slight level of concession within them. So the animation that we showed there was exactly the way that we present this to the jury. Before we present plans, drawings of the model, we were trying to convey the cinematic quality of the project and the idea that it will produce this immersive condition and all based like in the first Alien of Ridley Scott, that you can never see the whole monster, so you only can see the project in complete when you look back. In any case, for those of you who are still in the audience, the other thing that we learned with this competition is that to win a competition, you need an engineer with a British accent. We worked here in LA with Bruce Danziger, but Bruce couldn't come to the meeting in New York, so he sent a colleague from the New York office who didn't have a clue about the project, but he had a beautiful British accent when the jury asked, but if this thing is going to hold, so I said, well, I'm going to let our engineer to answer. And the only thing that he said was, but of course. But he said it with a great British accent, so that, I would say, is a good tip that make you believe it. But the thing is, and Tom Whisker is here, who also did PS1, this project is absolutely ridiculous because since they tell you that you win until you build, you have roughly between 8 to 9 weeks to figure it out how you can build it, so you make it up as you go by. Alexis Rochas was incredibly instrumental for us to make it happen. So I always grateful to him for that, and also he was the guy in charge he was the backup in the team, so everybody will feel when he show up. But nevertheless, the idea was that it was an interesting lessons because we couldn't get away for multiple reasons, time, budgets, and so on, to use only kind of computational numeric technology of fabrication. So we had to mix very old school, hardcore bending and welding with fabric and zippers, and then we have all the benches and the pulls done in lathe, in fiberglass and so on, which were done in the. But this is interesting. I mean, unfortunately, we don't get to build a lot, but once you do it, it's kind of interesting because the monster is alive. It never stops. So those benches that were all flawless and beautiful in LA, they were painted and finished in the dry weather. So when we move into the humid New York summer, in 24 hours start to develop bubbles in the painting. And Drura Parish, who is a SCI-Arc graduate who fabricated all this, was literally crying when I walked in one day. So, and it was the same day that Nikolai Neurosov, the critic for the New York Times, came to see it. And he was talking like, that was beautiful touch because I was into the grotesque. And I said, yes, of course. we did that completely on purpose. But my point was that you learn that things are never completely in your control. And to me, that was one of the most beautiful lessons about doing PS1. These are the almost 1,500 structure piece. They're not two equals. I mean, this was absolutely stupid. You learn that later. I mean, as I said, we were doing the drawings as we were manufacturing them. This is the moment that you think, why the hell I'm not a minimalist? These are all the pieces when we brought it from LA. It took us a couple of days to figure it out how they were going. And the Rhino script only wore 0.5%. So the other thing was a lot of eyeballing into it. And the cool part for me was it completely fell apart within 2 weeks. The firing was, because it was cheap, it was completely saggy. So the only thing left after 8 weeks was the structure. The fiberglass pool were completely destroyed because there's 6,000 people in the race. But the interesting thing for me was to understand that whatever you were working kind of as a problem of abstraction, whatever logic you start to develop as cellular systems and trying to build into large organizations and so on, if you're lucky enough to get some of them built, they start to have a life of their own and they have their own entity. So to me, to start to develop other logics of control, it was a really interesting problem to start to think about it and how you start to expand the repertoire in terms of how you work. And this thing I was talking about, the problem of virtuosity. So the notion of to start to work with multiple cells that they can grow and reorganize. Nokia was one of the sponsors for PS1, so they asked us to develop a series of ideas for kiosks and products and so on. So we developed, this was kind of a very abstract generic thing, but it was basically one of the first ones that we started to speculate more about this idea of cell systems and kind of start to produce kind of their own, not a growing thing, but a body of work that can be completely reacting with each other without not being so exposed to external factors. Now, that also has their limits and problems. So this was around 2006. And one of the byproducts of PS1 was also that there was a series of investors that were doing a development in the Dominican Republic, and the guy asked us, again, we always attract these kind of weird clients that they don't want to commission us a project, they want us to give them ideas for weird things. So basically what we developed for this guy was kind of a monster, a Frankenstein, that you can develop out of that, like things to put in the beach or foliage or landscape strategies and so on. So it's not really a project, but it's much more like almost like a genetic code. So, so I would say that is mostly the experiment period of the work. After that, in concert with that, the ambition of the cinematic, of the ambition of the science fiction quality, and the ambition of the total isolation of the project, it became more and more an obsession. And I would say also we can divide this not only in episodes, but also we can divide this in obsessions. I will say that the work, for good and for bad, virtuous and defect, is incredibly obsessive with certain things. And as I said, we always work on 4 or 5 projects and revolve around a singular idea. So there is a lot of redundancy, there is a lot of excessive quality to it. There is also a certain level of exuberance and oversaturation of what is need to be done. So we tend to do more than they need to be done sometimes in the project, but that's the price I'm willing to pay for it. So the next one was to start to say, okay, what is the stream, what is the limit that we can produce of variation with a singular cell? And the one on the right, which we'll get back into a minute, it was a competition for a guest house in Paris. We start to work with multiple cells. And instead to work with a singular entity, we start to work with multiple and kind of start to configure it. The only one that we got to manufacture was for a solo show in SF MOMA, curated by Joe Rosa. It seems to be that we have a better reception in our museum than we have with real clients. But again, it was a combination of, I always joke that this was our Mexican milling machine. There was this amazing 5 Mexican guys that worked for stage design. So we manufactured one part and then it was done and finished in an imperfect way. So the show was a series of the cell system that started to establish the whole animation a little bit what I'm showing here. and then it will move into a full display that will hold like a smaller group of families of projects within that. But in this one, we start to speculate with the material for real. What happened as an accident in PS1, that's something that we start to operate. We accelerate the chemical relationship between the fiberglass and the painting and all that to start to produce imperfection, to start to produce follicles, and to start to work in a kind of a, I would not say disgusting, but certain to the production of imperfection. One of the things that interests me the most, I will say, is that when you look into the historical work of painting, or you look at classical painting, there was an obsession, especially in the religious painting, there was an obsession to the production of perfection through imperfect methodologies. And I'm interested in the reverse of that. I think the computer and the computational work produce a sense of perfection that I find it kind of repulsive, and we try to find a way, mechanisms on how we can corrupt them and how we can contaminate them. So this notion to start to work with more than one entity, to start to work with multiple cells, is a way to start to introduce a certain level of friction. And to me, the problem of friction and the problem that the work is never comfortable and the project never seems to be complete, it's an absolutely critical thing. So the one that it was just a competition for a library in Stockholm. This is an installation for the Pompidou, which right now is probably in coma 4. It's almost dead. I don't want to say it's dead because I always have a hope that it will come back to life. But all of these were like a direct byproduct of the animation that you were saying, the right, with the multiple cells, and the one that you're looking right now, which is for the pitch black in the MAK Center in Austria. That we start to reverse engineer that. In that case, we start with a kind of a formless condition and start to see if we can build our way back into kind of a defined boundaries and edges and start to organize how the project can go back from a kind of a formless condition into a much more organized one. And those two projects generated all these series of families, which have this kind of what Wolf Briggs called mercurial chewing gum quality, which is this kind of a liquid, continuous editing, filling, so that the parts are all different, but they start to produce a whole. So the idea of the cells that move into organs that can produce a new whole, and the whole can produce a sense of totality, but it's not based on a seamless or a continuous one, but it's based on one that you can recognize the different moments, is something that is still interests me, but that's something that was triggered through these projects. Natalie Ceruzzi, which is a very interesting art collector and client, she owns a house that was done by Claude Perrant, which have 3 sculptures under the block. So she wanted to have this guest house, gallery, pavilion for artists. At the end, she decided, I mean, not that we got the project, but she decided not to do it and bought the house next door. And later on, she commissioned it to us, a small pavilion that we're doing right now. But nevertheless, that's the one that we were doing. And our ambition here was, even from the structure foundation and the drawings, to start to understand if we can produce a house, and it's not based on a singular entity, but a house, a small guest house that can work as a compound, that can work as a series of habitat. So the cellular thing, it doesn't become only a way to organize the project, but it became also a way to organize the building and to organize the space and try to understand how they can work and start to pay more careful attention. Okay, how we can assemble this? Can we fabricate this? Can we build this? So the work, I like to think that evolves into try to see a certain logic about to start to think how the pieces can go together and how they can start to relate with each other in a way that goes beyond just the virtuosity of the form. This is the installation of the MAK Center in Vienna. We call it Pitch Black, another solo show. And in that case, was trying to see if in a space we could capture the cinematic of the multiplicity of the cell and the idea of to produce a new continuity through multiple parts. So in this case, we start to work with the notion of repetition and variation. It's not a big secret, but the body is always the same, and the legs are always slightly different. And through that simple effect, you can produce a notion of movement, and the things are kind of in change. The gallery is a very long one, and so we painted all black, and we put the very specific light. So it's one of the few things that we've done in the past that I can keep looking at, and I think it was quite okay. Everything else that we do, I tend to hate, and for me, these lectures are incredibly painful and so to the dentist, and because you have to revisit everything you've done wrong, which is interesting in itself, but nevertheless, it's kind of an autopsy and keep revisiting all the bodies that you kill. That being said, the autopsy is a very interesting model, and it's something that we use a lot. I mean, usually the end of the death of one project, it becomes the beginning of the next one, and the idea that the project works by families and that one can move from another and another and another is something that fascinates me. Maybe it's because I don't have that many ideas, and so I try to stretch as much as I can the few I had. But also, I would say this is the last project probably that I don't know if, can you move one more in that one? Okay, just keep it there. That probably the pitch black to an extent was kind of the last project that I did. I wouldn't say that I modeled it all myself, but until then I still was modeling myself a big chunk of the projects. After that, we were trying to get a little bit busier and we're trying to produce more. So the impact of the people that work with me in the office is, for me, is incredibly important. And for those of you who have been in the school around, and from people like people that over the year work with me, like I mentioned already, Drew Parrish, Stephen Ma, Ed Kim, Nick Kinney now, and Michael Young, and for sure I'm forgetting some others, and they did a lot of work. I always like to try to incorporate their contamination and start to keep it more as a kind of a living organism that we can absorb and relate to that. So the work is not only the byproduct, the ideas that I have, but also the interaction with those collaboration and how you work with that, but also how over the years you start to change the way that you work. So in that project, this project from the MAK and on, my work became more like the director in the sense that you start to edit, and I still work at the beginning and with the cells and so on, but then you leave the project out of your hands a little bit, and other people work on them and they come back. So to start to rethink about it and how to start to reorganize it and start to think in families, you start to change the way that you work. But I like that notion of that corruption, and I think that idea that the work start to have their own entity. I just notice all the time that every time I talk about the work, I talk the work like it's almost that it's not that it doesn't belong to me, but they have their own life. So I always feel like I'm much more interested in that the work is almost like a wild horse, and you try to figure it out how to guide it, and not so much to try to be predeterministic. I know that that's kind of an illusion, and I know it's kind of a product of imagination to an extent, but nevertheless, it's a nice fantasy to have that the work has an entity on their own. But the obsessions that keep moving, this is the other version I was talking about, Ceruzzi, the Ceruzzi how it became this small pavilion, which also we're not going to do this one either. But in this one, you can start to see in place the idea how each of these logics start to become more complex and so on. But the notion of, one thing I'm interested in to start to operate is with the notion of misfits and things that they don't necessarily go together. So one of the things when we were speculating with the INS chair and try to see if we can produce a virus or a script contamination that can take the ink chairs into something else. So something that became almost a game ended becoming a commission for the Art Institute, and then we ended doing it and fabricating it. I truly hate it. I mean, I really hate this, but we get to fabricate this. It's one of those things that, I don't know if that happens to everybody, but usually the one that you like the most, or the one that you feel more committed to it, are the one that they never go forward, and the one that you care the less are the one that somebody seems to care. But we did it, and it had the quality that it has. But the thing that interests me about that is a sense of the elephant man, the sense of deformation and the sense of mutation. And the notion of mutants and species is one that I would say it will start to take more and more over the work. I mean, this notion of the misfit and commit much more to this notion of a species. And the idea of to work more and more with by friction and almost by, if we can find opportunity for oppositions. This was probably the matrix of that and the origin of that, of the whole misfit family and the mutation and the notion of a species as a way to think an alternative way to the problem of type. This was a retrospective show that the Hammer did a couple of years ago, in 2008, on John Lautner. They invite 5 architects and they give each of us one of the iconic houses of John Lautner, and they ask us to add a 25% of the square footage to it. That was the whole premise. We got the chemosphere, which is probably one of the most famous ones. And one thing that was interesting to me is, if you look at movies of the late 60s, early 70s, the chemosphere was always used for the evil guy in Bond movies or stuff like that. So for popular culture, cultural thing, this way of architecture was kind of evil or represent a certain, the opposite of goodness at least. And we thought that the chemosphere as today, in 2008, it was not evil enough anymore. So the idea was, can we produce a torture, can we torture architecture? Can we produce chambers of torture or some kind of, I don't know, castrate. We were looking a lot into castration machines and all stuff like that from the medieval to see if that can also produce a different condition of beauty, a different kind of, I don't know, at the end of the day, I think it's always, it has to do with this problem of arousal and this notion of management of desire and how you deal with those conditions to relation to the problem of form. But the other thing was, this was probably the first project and we started to incorporate pieces of very recognizable geometry, like you will see pieces of circles. If you look at any project that we did before, there was always a desire that always to create a new figure, so it's almost always like a figure on figure on figure and an excess, and an excessive condition of that. Within this one, we start to incorporate pieces of recognizable geometry that I think it completely, in my view, I think it completely changed the perception of the work. So even though I think the work was hammering on that problem of the horrific and so on, I think we start to have a different kind of a mood and a different kind of sensibility to it, that I think it start to go into a different trajectory. And also we start to, I don't know, to rethink about the problem of plans and sections and what that means in this condition and how the plans are more like MRIs, almost like maps or cartography, so they're not necessarily only notational system, but they're almost like guiding things to fully understand how things move around this kind of monster. So when Eric was showing the Don Quixote and the monsters, of course my physique had to do much more with the monster than with Don Quixote, or with Sancho Panza, which was, he was fat. I always think that there is something interesting about the anomaly of the monstrosity, because I think the monstrosity, if you put a lot of monsters together, the monsters are not monsters anymore, and vice versa. So all those things are much more in reaction to the other territories. It's much more in reaction to the condition of the friction, but in one way I have to accept and admit that the work is so autonomous and so artistic in their own sense that I would say sometimes some of the concepts I'm talking about, maybe they don't apply. But I like to think that they apply in the sense of my own internal obsessions and my own internal, I don't know, a sponge of way to see the world. So, can we move in that one? Some of this work, as I was saying, the notion of scales, or the notion of multiple scales, is something that obsesses me and fascinates me. So the possibility that you can work in a building or visual effects in a movie, on product design, part of the same family is something that we try to operate. So When we were commissioned by Francesca von Habsburg from the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection to do one of the art museum pavilions for her, the site is in Patagonia in Argentina. So we were trying with the misfit, and in this case it's multiple cells, it's 5 cells that belong to 5 different formal vocabularies, and then it's about trying to negotiate that and how that can start to activate how a museum works and how you relate to it. In parallel to that, we were working in a silverware collection for Alessi. This was the first version that we did, and this is the prototype so far as far we go. But both of them were operating on similar principles, and then of course we produced this monstrosity. And I'm not saying this monstrosity in the context of the conversation. I think this is probably the worst thing that we ever done. The one on your left is a tower for a competition in Dubai. And I think this is as bad as I get, and it's excessive exuberance in the worst kind, so move on. But I wanted to show it because, I mean, I think today is kind of like a group therapy, and trying. One of the things is, in this way, when you lecture in your home, is I cannot say as many lies I will say in another place. I'm saying some, but it's much more easy to get caught. So that is a terrible project, but we did it, and it's done. So now we're getting closer into the territory, and this still is with the problem of misfit, and what Andy Sago called awkward, which I like it a lot. It has to do with this ambition of, as I said, that you can start to read the part and the whole, and each part is a whole, and the whole is a part, and it has this kind of a condition to it that it triggers a different kind of sensibility, so it almost has this kind of explosive conditions, almost like if you cut somebody open and all the stomach, I don't know how you call it, visceras, will come out. So in parallel to that, Selfridges in London commissions us to do an art installation for their windows in London. It didn't get done. I mean, this was right before the economic crisis. So, but if you look at it, are basically the same pieces that we were developing for the museum, scale it up and change it and get it out of any sense of space into something in a different territory. But I like the idea when we work in small pieces because it allows me to really allows us in the office to recalibrate the relation between the parts and how they go. One thing that fascinates me a lot is this duplicity about to not be clear what is the plan, what is the section, that usually architecture installation or art installation or even product design has a level of freedom than when you're working more on the building scale, it's less so. So there is this kind of a notion of total design to operate within that, which I find incredibly interesting. That mutated into a different version for the Pompidou show, which also is not going to happen in that version. And that's bringing us closer to, say, what is more what the focus of the work is right now, which it had to do with friction, viruses, and contaminations. How they work, for me, is starting to get more interesting what in getting friction in relation with existing conditions and when it belongs to almost a dialogue between two different languages and two different idioms and almost two different cultures, how they can start to negotiate those territories. And how that condition of the continuity and the accumulation of parts can start to play a role with that. But also I think it gives you a sense of a scale and the manipulation of a scale and the formal relation between them, which I think is really interesting. This was a competition for a multimedia museum in San Sebastián in Spain, which is called Tabakalera because it was an old tobacco factory. So you have to preserve at least 75% of that building. So the notion of the prosthetic and the notion of amputation and the notion of mutilation and how we can produce mutation within that, it's something that I think it triggered a whole series of projects, even though the project that we're working right now, even though we're not working in friction with an existing condition, we try to produce almost like opposite and almost like rival teams that they will fight for kind of a formal territory and a spatial territory. So the museum will have all these exhibition spaces and offices and so on, like any other ones. But one of the things that we're trying to rethink was to go back to certain principles to to hide an entrance or not to make it so evident, so multiple attacks of entry. But this notion of the prosthetics and the notion how the mutilation of existing building and the creation of a new prosthetic have to rethink. It will force the fabric of the city and the fabric of the building to be to reconfigure itself. So it will not have a main entrance. It will have multiple connections from bridges to the different parts of the city, and you will have multiple ways to access. Anyway. Part of that episode of Family or Mutants was another competition for a museum. This one was in Warsaw, in Poland. It was we decided we realized and we put it in the wrong part of the site, but not that we had a chance to win anyway. We put it right in the right part of the site. But I thought that putting it in the middle of the highway was the most interesting idea to put a project to try to anchor there and then to try to conquer as much of territory. This is something that Enrique Miralles always used to do, which I always fascinate me, which was the idea not to make nature to become part of architecture, but to make the artificiality of architecture stretch as much as almost became part of nature. So when people tell me about the work, oh, you work into this organic, I hate that because I think the work that we produce is incredibly artificial. It have nothing to do with organic, even though it may have a kind of a sensibility that relates to that, but in the way that it's conceived, it's about those conditions of that. That brings me to the 5th episode, which have to do with rituals, which is a much more recent development interest. These are from the Dead Ringer, from the David Cronenberg movie, the Jeremy Irons plays the gynecologist genius twins, that they develop their own tools, which are all for for babies with deformation and so on. The funny thing is, a guy from Cleveland owned it, and they're made out of paper. Those things that they look heavy and so on, they're made, it's an anecdotic, it doesn't matter. But that was something that we were looking into rethink about the notion of rituals and the notion of ornament, formal articulation, excessive exuberance through different cultures and different history as a way to celebrate ritual, as a way also for instrument, as a way to killing or saving life or whatever you want to call it. But there is this notion of ritual that it fascinates me, which always have to do with from churches to and so on, that they always have related with this kind of excessive formal vocabulary. So when we were developing this other version for the analysis collection for metal pieces, we were looking a lot into that, but also we were trying to anchor more and more the cinematic condition to it. So for us, when we work in the animation on the films, it's not only about to show it to the client, it's not the fly through, it's much more to understand the scale, the sensibility, the physical, kind of a fake physical quality to the thing, and how you start to relate to it and how you start to think on the form. So it's not so much about the pure composition of the geometry, but you have to do much more with editing. Now, it goes from there. This is a wine cover, that was a cork screwer, the different drawings for it. My favorite, which is the silverware, they say, aside that it's too complicated, at least he said they were afraid that the people would hurt themselves. But I was trying to convince them that we can do the plastic, like we did the thing in the MAK and chrome them, and produce this kind of a sense of fake of weight and weightless, and so the pieces can almost feel ethereal like animation. So there is always that kind of a, I don't know, when I look and think about the work, there's a lot of contradiction, because in a way the work, it hammers on the horrific, but also always go back to certain rules of elegance and certain rules of beauty. It hammers on certain notion of weight and metal and disturbing thing, but at the same time always try to work with certain level of harmony. So I think, I don't know, contradiction and friction of opposition, I always think is a good territory for the project for any project to work on it. And this one I like it because it's like a notation, like a music notation thing. This is the spoon, which is the set, like in this end is very classical. Any silverware starts from the spoon. Any silverware through history you can look at. This is the butter plate and all that. The glass. We were looking into Russian tea sets. I would say also that the most recent work, as I mentioned, the Russian tea set, have to do with that. Also, we're looking at kind of a normal condition and see if we can make it pathological. If we can transform from the normal to the pathological, and so you can recognize the Russian tea set and make it into something else. This is whatever it is. I don't even know the name for it. These are ashtrays, which are my favorite, because I smoke. And this is my absolute favorite, the cigar cutter. What is interesting is like, basically we spend a lot of time working in this project for Aggressive. So, I don't know, every year and a half, more or less, it's not done on purpose, but it almost has like a biological clock. Like around every year and a half, we always try to revisit and that to create, like not start from zero, but take a family and see if we can completely distort it and destroy it into something else. So the Alessi project was an interesting one because I think it gave us a lot of freedom, because this thing I was talking about, the total three-dimensionality that an object has. I know that buildings, of course, are three-dimensional too, but in the way that you work around them, it's not the same than you work in an object. So the objects give you a level of freedom on how you operate within that, and how you understand it as a piece and how the parts goes together. That I think it gave us a huge amount of material and tools to work in a series of families. So the Alessi became this display system, which was originally what we were trying to do for the Venice Biennale for the Austrian Pavilion, and Eric curated. And of course, we couldn't afford it at the end to do it. So some of those ideas start to mutate into another one. So, but the condition of the misfit, the condition of decay, the condition of degradation, all the things that I always been interesting to me as an abstract problem with the work, we try to see if we can make it physical, if we can get it into that. So in a small installation that we did for the MAK apartment here in Los Angeles, with very, very tiny budget, we thought that we can develop a structure out of flowers with a series of these out-of-the-shell plastic bubbles with a series of monitors inside that show animations. And the exhibition will be there for 3 months under the sun, so it will change colors and smell and so on. And the other thing which this notion of decay and flower interests me is because it has to do with this notion of the rituals. And the idea that these elements can be for the celebration of happiness or for the celebration of death. And there's all this kind, and I don't want to go phenomenological or mumbo-jumbo mystical. I mean, I'm fairly far from that. I'm interested in the physical act of those things. I'm interested in the organization of the ritual. I'm interested in the condition of how those things, what they mean from different cultures. So Peter Nord joked that this was the Mexican funeral. But I like how the thing will decay and transform over time. And this is after a month. And how those things can start to work. And all the thing was working in relation to the Alessi and to the exhibition and so on. But then the whole thing on the flower and so on, it was an interesting idea about how to start to work with a project. This is a competition for so somewhere between a project and a master plan in Taiwan. They have a council and so on. But what interested me about this one was the idea that we start to incorporate the flowers and vegetation as a way to ornament. And it became almost as a limitation after years of experiments in the office, but also with the students, trying to figure out how to use color in the projects, and I sort of give up because I always go back to the metallic and the reflective. I'm like a fish. I'm attracted to shiny things. But the flowers and the vegetation was an interesting way to start to deal with the problem of color through reflection and so on, but also as a way that the building can change over time. It can have decay, can change colors through the different seasons. And ultimately, it can start to add another layer to the problem, but also this kind of the artificial nature, the normal and the pathological, and start to work more in relation to that condition. So in this one, we start to go farther and farther with the notion of the rituals and the flowers and the ornament and the dislocation of multiple entities. So, I don't know, there is kind of a limitation in the work because if you look at that, each of the project is basically an accumulation of the previous one. So we build on the previous one and we add new layers to it. So in this case, it's not a huge project. It's roughly 7,000 square feet, this version. So this one was, I would say, 60% a pavilion, 40% a park. I have like 2 exhibition areas, a couple of offices, and a little house for an artisan residence and so on. It's in the mountains, in the middle of nowhere in Patagonia. And the section actually is fairly simple. It's a singular space on one level. But all the complexity also was with the idea that we know that the chances of this to get built completely was not there. So part of the idea is the project is always in a permanent state of incompleteness. So we can only build external structure as an art pavilion and it will hold. Or she can build one volume with this and it will work. So it's done in such a way that it's kind of a Frankenstein that you can tear apart, almost like a Goya painting that you can isolate. So it's like figure on figure on figure that you can reconfigure in some particular way. And of course, the title of the lecture had to do a lot with this work, The Horns of Plenty. It comes from the Horns of Plenty, which had to do with all British literature. The Horns of Plenty is a hollow horn on the surface, but inside is full of an infinite amount of flowers and plants, and it can be renewed constantly. So, I don't know if it's evident or not, the work goes try to operate always in the frontier of imagination and how the imagination can trigger of that, and how the reality is not necessarily a constraint, but more like friction or something more that you battle against. And in that sense, maybe it has to do with this notion of Don Quixote that Eric was talking at the beginning. This is the other Mexican funeral in Venice. This one is really more Italian. Pictures of the model. This is the same animation, but just we have a little bit of audio, just for the kick of it. No? Can we have audio? I don't know, we were just trying to play with somehow that they didn't have music, more like a series of songs. Anyway, more pictures of them all. Okay, the last thing I want to show are the 2 projects that is work in progress. So what I'm enjoying right now is not final, it's what we're doing, and with the guys in the office the last 2 or 3 days we're trying to put together the renders and images because I always like to show what we're working right now. So the episode 6, which is the one that we're moving now, is still on the notion of ritual, but we add rough and we add pampas to it. And I don't know if it's because I'm turned the curve of 40, and right now I'm 42, so I'm hardcore in the 40s. Even though in architecture, I'm a young architect, which means, for me, the young architect is a definition. As far as you don't build, you are a young architect. So I think I'm going to be a young architect for a while. But I don't know what it is, or, I mean, death and life, or the death of people in your family, or what it is. But at some moment you start to look back into your own culture and your own, I don't know, heritage and your own DNA and stuff that you think you didn't care for many years, and some of it they start to pop in your back of your head, and you start to pay attention. So recently, in the last 4 or 5 months, I've been looking a lot into the gaucho rituals and traditions in Argentina, and it has to do the way that they cook the meat and they cook the whole cow, but also the way that they do ponchos. And it had this kind of a brutal, which I found fascinating, interaction between incredible refinement and precise and sophisticated ornaments and geometries and metal and craft about all these silver plates. All these things are from the 19th century, and you can see in the horse. But also is the interaction between that with the raw meat and all those things, and how this is to hit on the side of the horse. So you have all this level of refinement, but with this kind of a brutal, raw condition, which is the ultimate misfit and it's the ultimate ritual, and I think it has to do with at least interest in obsession, and I think it can produce a work to go in a very, I don't like to use the word original, because nothing I think in architecture is really new. It's always really an accumulation of innovation. And it has to do with, as I said, personal obsession, but certainly as a way to start to break away by certain default conditions that any given time or any contemporary time works. So I think always, at the end of the day, architecture has to deal with the problem to negotiate the slowness of it, the negotiation between, at the end you can say that architecture only can truly exist in a state of present, not really in the past, not really in the future, but the only way that you can construct temporary present is looking into this notion of past, trying to figure it out how that will operate in the future. So at the end, that's why you work on it. So this notion of the ritual and rough and pampas and the gauchos and raw, ultimately, is something that I think it triggered when I think my interest goes now, which is to make, if there was an attempt to produce a synthetic nature or an artificial nature between parts, right now the work is much more comfortable playing at the difference of the part. So this is a much smaller version that at the end we're doing for Natalie Cerusi, a small bench area in the garden, and what originally started as a kind of a much more refined piece, I got much more obsessed with rustication and decay and imperfection and the construction of imperfection and how you can build the anomaly within the systems. So you can almost make them collapse and play around that. And we are right. I mean, we're gonna fabricate this. I think it's gonna be up by September, October in her house. It's gonna be there in her house in the garden. And hopefully we can do more of them, and we can bring them to Pampas and do cow skins, which I saw that Jason is working on that too. So something weird about that, but I don't know. The condition of the weird, the condition of the misfit is something that I think the work tried relentless to keep pursuing and to keep developing a sensibility in relation to that, and start to figure out how we can fabricate an ensemble and all those things. And the last thing is, this is the latest version of the Thyssen Mona Lisa pavilion, which we go in full raw pampas, ritual cows. Maybe too literal, but I don't know, probably tomorrow I'll hate it, but today excites me a lot. As I said, this is at the base of the mountains in Patagonia, so the site has, the the previous version, as I said, was 60% building, 40% park. You can go back in the other one. This one is 15% a pavilion, 85% park. So the pavilion is just this little thing. Everything else is like a park. We are developing this kind of micro botanical gardens that thing can go, and we're trying to work with copper and let the metal oxidate and layer rough with the ships and so on. And not that we were looking to think it look like meat, that's really copper, and the idea is to have very unique plants. So you want to have a collection of plants from all over the world inside those kind of a botanic gardens, inside the bubbles. This is very, very cold climate and very brutal climate. And then the exhibition area actually the size of the pavilion is 2 times more or less the entire gallery. It's very small, and they have a bathroom and a gift shop. And probably it's not going to be the last version anyway. But this is where the work is right now, and I think is where the work I want to explore. By no means I will say this is figured out. I think this is just the beginning, and I think it has a lot of imperfections. And for sure we're going to ruin it later. I mean, usually the origin is always better than, more often than not, is better than what happened later when you try to refine it too much. The idea is that they will celebrate with a small town there, the people can come. It's a really rural area. I don't think it's going to go that wild, but it will be nice. So if I can have the audio, I would like to finish with a clip. I always like it a lot because I think it defines always a sense of time and permanence for me, and particularly these 10 years I've been in SCI-Arc. I mean, as I said, I cannot imagine that we would have done anything this without interaction with SCI-Arc. So in any way, you guys are all collectively responsible for this. I want to share the blame. We have the audio? Yeah. So I like this clip a lot.
Really okay. Trust me. Everything's gonna be fine. You met me at a very strange time in my life. When your feet are on the air,
That's it, thank you.